The history of pain relief. A bedtime story. Imagine a world without painkillers. Not just a world without pills or injections, a world where the only way to deal with pain is to grit your teeth, hold on to something solid and wait. Where surgery is torture, where a toothache can last for weeks, where women in labor sometimes swore they would never go through it again. That world existed just 200 years ago, in some places 50. But even then, people didn't give up. They searched, they experimented, they made mistakes, sometimes died from their own experiments, and kept searching for something that could steal the pain away, even for just an hour. This is the story of how they found it. Part 1. The Poppy and the God of Sleep. Let's begin with the oldest. About 6,000 years ago, on the fertile plains between the Tigris and Euphrates, Sumerian farmers grew a strange flower. It was beautiful, large petals, soft as silk. But they didn't grow it for its beauty. They grew it for its juice. If you cut into the unripe seed pod of this flower, the poppy, a white sticky liquid seeps out. In the air, it darkens and hardens. The Sumerians called this plant hulgil, the joy plant. They knew what we know today. Opium relieves pain. It relaxes the body. It brings a feeling of warmth and safety. It pulls you into a sweet, heavy sleep. From the Sumerians, the plant passed to the Babylonians. From the Babylonians to the Egyptians. The Egyptians gave opium to children who couldn't sleep. Ancient papyri contain recipes, a mixture of opium with fly droppings scraped from the wall to stop a child from crying. It sounds horrifying, but the opium in that mixture genuinely worked. The Greeks received the poppy from the Egyptians and turned it into something more than medicine. They made it into a god. Hypnos, the god of sleep, was depicted holding poppy seed pods. His brother Thanatos, the god of death, too. Because the ancient Greeks understood perfectly well. Between deep sleep and death from an opium overdose, the only difference is the dose. The Greek physician Galen, who lived in the 2nd century AD, was a genuine enthusiast of opium. He prescribed it for everything: headaches, toothaches, deafness, epilepsy, plague. He wrote that opium counteracts poison and venomous bites, cures chronic headache, vertigo, deafness, apoplexy, weakness of sight, bronchitis, shortness of breath, coughs, bloody sputum, abdominal pains. The list went on for another half a page. Galen exaggerated, of course, but in one thing he was right. For pain, opium genuinely worked, and so it continued for nearly 1,000 years. When Rome fell and Europe sank into the Dark Ages, opium didn't disappear. It migrated east. Arab physicians, heirs to Greek medicine, preserved knowledge of it and developed it further. Avicenna, Ibn Sina, the brilliant Persian doctor, wrote an entire chapter on opium in his Book of Healing. He knew about addiction, he warned against it, but he still acknowledged, for pain, there was nothing better. In medieval Europe, opium returned with the Crusaders and merchants. It was mixed with wine, with honey, with herbs. Such mixtures were called theriac, an antidote for everything. Apothecaries sold it as a panacea. Some recipes contained 60 or 70 ingredients, and opium was always among them. But there was one problem. Opium is a raw substance, not pure. It contains hundreds of different compounds, and its effect depended on where the poppy grew, how it was harvested, how it was stored. Dosage was nearly impossible to predict. People fell asleep forever thinking they were taking their usual amount. For painkillers to become real medicine rather than a gamble, science was needed. And science arrived. Part 2. The Boy in the Pharmacy, 1804. Paderborn, a small town in western Germany. A 20-year-old pharmacy apprentice named Friedrich Serturner sits in a laboratory doing what was considered nearly impossible, trying to isolate something pure from opium. He had no university education. He didn't know organic chemistry. It barely existed yet. He had only curiosity, stubbornness, and a pile of raw opium. For several years he poured acids, filtered, evaporated, crystallized, again and again. And finally, he had it. A white crystalline substance, unremarkable in appearance. But when he gave it to mice, they fell asleep. When he gave it to himself, he felt a wave of warmth and complete calm. He named it after the Greek god of sleep, Morpheus, morphine. This was a turning point. For the first time in history, humanity had a pure, predictable substance that relieved pain. Not a mixture, not a brew, not a juice of unknown content, but a specific molecule with a specific effect. But Serturner didn't stop at the discovery. He did something that today would be called a horrifying ethical violation. He conducted clinical trials on himself and 3 of his friends. They took doses of morphine, large doses. Too large, all 4 nearly died. Serturner saved them by forcing them to drink large amounts of vinegar. The acid neutralized the alkaloid's effect. Then he wrote about it in a scientific journal with astonishing calm, as if describing an ordinary chemistry experiment. The medical world initially paid no attention. A young pharmacy apprentice without a degree. Who was he? But then came war. The Napoleonic Wars demanded surgeons, and surgeons demanded something that would allow them to operate on the wounded without listening to their screams. Morphine proved ideal. By the 1820s, it was being manufactured industrially. By the 1850s, when the syringe arrived, it could be injected directly into the bloodstream. Soldiers in the American Civil War received morphine from their doctors. They received it and couldn't stop. More than 400,000 veterans after the war suffered from addiction. It was called soldier's disease. Humanity had obtained the most powerful painkiller in its history and immediately confronted the price. Something else was needed. Part 3. The Hero from Bayer. 1897. The laboratory of the chemical company Bayer in the city of Wuppertal. A young chemist named Felix Hoffmann sits at his desk thinking about his father. His father suffered from arthritis, severe joint pain. The doctor prescribed salicylic acid, a substance long extracted from willow bark that genuinely helped with pain and inflammation. But in pure form, it destroyed the stomach. His father swallowed it and writhed with nausea. Hoffmann wanted to help. He began looking for a way to make salicylic acid gentler on the stomach. And he found one. By adding an acetyl group to the molecule, he obtained acetyl salicylic acid. The therapeutic effect remained. The stomach irritation diminished. The company Bayer registered the trademark. They called it simply aspirin. A for acetyl, spir from Spirea ulmaria, a plant from which salicylic acid was also extracted. In, the standard ending for medicines. On the 5th of March 1899, aspirin came to market. What happened next can only be called a revolution. Aspirin sold in millions of packages. In the First World War, it saved soldiers from pain and fever. After the war, during the terrible pandemic of Spanish flu, a strain of influenza that killed more people than the war itself, aspirin relieved symptoms and gave the sick at least some relief. But the most astonishing discovery about aspirin came not in 1897, but 70 years later. British pharmacologist John Vane finally understood in 1971 why aspirin works. It turned out to block an enzyme that produces prostaglandins, substances that cause inflammation and pain. For this discovery, Vane received the Nobel Prize. And alongside this came another revelation. If aspirin blocks these enzymes in blood vessels, it also reduces clotting, which means a small daily dose of aspirin could prevent heart attacks and strokes. A tablet invented to help Hoffman's father swallow medicine without nausea has probably saved hundreds of millions of human lives. But while Bayer was selling aspirin, they were selling another product, also made from opium, also marketed as a safe alternative to morphine. They called it heroin. This is not a joke or a mistake. Bayer advertised heroin as a cough medicine, for tuberculosis, even as a treatment for morphine addiction. By the time the mistake was recognized, it was too late. Heroin had taken to the streets and had no intention of leaving. Part 4, the operating table, before and after. But let's step back a little, because there is another thread in this story we haven't touched yet. Painkillers for everyday pain, that's one thing. But there is also surgery. Until the middle of the 19th century, an operation was a horror. Imagine, you are lying on a table. Several large men are holding you down. Orderlies whose only job is to keep you from falling off the table while the surgeon cuts. You might have been given some alcohol. It dulls sensitivity slightly. You might have been struck on the head. If you're lucky, you'll lose consciousness. But most often, no. You simply lie there and scream. Surgeons prided themselves on speed. The best could amputate a leg in a minute, not because they were rushing, but because every extra second was an extra second of pain and shock. Robert Liston, the great surgeon of the 19th century, amputated so quickly that once during an operation, legend says this is true, he cut off the fingers of the assistant holding the leg. The patient and the assistant both later died of infection, and one onlooker, operations were sometimes watched by students, died of a heart attack. The only operation in medical history with a 300% mortality rate. Something had to change. And it changed in 1842 in a small town in the state of Georgia. A country doctor named Crawford Long noticed a strange thing. Young people who inhaled ether at parties for amusement sometimes fell and hurt themselves, and felt no pain. Bruises appeared, but there was no pain. Long drew his conclusion and began using ether during operations. In March 1842, he removed a tumor from a patient's neck while the patient was under ether. The patient felt nothing. But Long was a modest man. He didn't rush to publish his discovery. He simply continued treating people in his rural practice. And so the official first public demonstration of anesthesia is considered to be a different event. The 16th of October, 1846. Boston, Massachusetts General Hospital. The hall was full. Students, doctors, skeptics, all had come to watch the fool who promised to operate without pain. Dentist William Morton had the patient inhale ether through a special mask. Surgeon John Warren made an incision in the neck, removed a vascular tumor. The operation lasted a few minutes. The patient did not wake, did not cry out, did not grab the surgeon's hands. When it was over, he opened his eyes and said he had felt nothing but a light touch. Warren turned to the audience and spoke the words that became famous. "Gentlemen, this is no humbug." The hall erupted. The news traveled the world in weeks, at the time, an astonishing speed. Within 2 months, ether was being used in London, Paris, Vienna. Within a year, across the world. Surgery had ceased to be torture. Part 5, the nurse who could not watch. But ether had its own problems. It irritated the airways. Patients woke up nauseated. It sometimes caught fire, and operating rooms in those days were lit by candles. An alternative was needed. It was found by a Scottish obstetrician named James Young Simpson. Simpson could not bear to watch women suffer during childbirth. He tested various chemical substances on himself, with friends, in the evenings, over dinner, as if it were a game. They inhaled different compounds, noted their sensations, fell asleep, woke up. One November evening in 1847, they tried chloroform. They woke up on the floor, overturned chairs, and scattered food around them. The feeling, lightness and euphoria. Simpson understood. This was it. Chloroform was more powerful than ether. It worked faster. It didn't burn. It didn't irritate as severely. But here too was a problem: dosage. between the amount that brought sleep and the amount that stopped the heart, a dangerously narrow gap. Patients sometimes died right there on the table, and eventually chloroform was banned. But Simpson had managed one more important thing before that happened. In 1853, Queen Victoria was giving birth to her 8th child, Prince Leopold. She asked to be given chloroform. The church was outraged. Suffering during childbirth is God's decree, punishment for Eve's original sin. To remove it, a sin. The Queen ignored them. When the Queen of the British Empire publicly chose anesthesia during childbirth, the debate was closed. Pain relief in labor became acceptable. Part 6. Soldiers and Discoveries. Let us move now to the 20th century, to a different kind of pain, and a different kind of discovery. The Second World War was horrifying in the scale of its wounds. Surgeons at the front operated in impossible conditions, and they needed something that could quickly and predictably anesthetize a patient for several hours. It was at this time that local anesthetics began to develop rapidly, but their story had started earlier, 1884. A young Viennese doctor named Karl Koller reads an article by his colleague. Someone we all know, but not for this reason. The colleague's name was Sigmund Freud. Freud was interested in cocaine. He believed it was a remedy for depression and morphine addiction. He used it himself. He wrote rapturous letters to his fiancée about the wonderful sensations the substance produced. In Freud's article, Koller read that cocaine caused numbness in the mouth. Numbness. Koller was an ophthalmologist. Operations on the eye are extraordinarily delicate. The patient must lie completely still. But from pain they move, blink, flinch. Koller dissolved cocaine in water and dropped it into his own eyes. A few minutes, and he could touch the eyeball with a needle and feel nothing. He demonstrated this at an ophthalmological congress. The result, a triumph. Cocaine became the first local anesthetic. Doctors used it for operations on the mouth, throat, eyes, and nose. But cocaine had obvious problems. It was dangerous. It caused addiction. Chemists began searching for a substitute. In 1905, Alfred Einhorn synthesized procaine, Novocaine. The very Novocaine that may have been injected before the drill at a dentist's office if you were born early enough. Later came lidocaine, safer still, more effective still. Today, local anesthesia is routine. The dentist makes an injection. You feel your tongue going numb, and you sit calmly while they drill, feeling nothing. 200 years ago, that would have been witchcraft. Part 7. The molecule humanity was searching for. Let us return to opiates, because this thread isn't finished yet. Morphine works. We've known that for 200 years. But it causes addiction, suppresses breathing, makes people drowsy and incapable of normal life. Why? How does it actually work? The answer came in 1973, and it was sensational. Researchers discovered that the human brain contains special receptors, molecular locks, that opiates fit like a key. But why would the human brain have receptors for a plant substance? The logical answer, because we have our own keys. And indeed, in 1975, scientists discovered endorphins, endogenous morphines, internal morphines, substances our brains produce themselves to regulate pain and mood. This is why, after a long run, you feel euphoria. This is why, in danger, a badly wounded soldier sometimes feels no pain until he reaches safety. This is why people in love say they feel a high, because their brain is literally flooding them with its own drugs. Opium had helped people for millennia because it mimicked substances that already live inside us. But could a painkiller be created that worked like morphine, without the addiction? This question has pursued pharmacologists to this day. Part of the answer came through an unexpected discovery. In the 1990s, doctors noticed that a drug called ketamine, an anesthetic used since the 1960s and simultaneously a popular recreational drug known as Special K, had another strange property. It treated depression, quickly, sometimes after a single dose. Today, a derivative of ketamine, esketamine, is used to treat severe depression that doesn't respond to other medications. A painkiller for the body had become medicine for the mind. The line between physical pain and psychological suffering turned out to be far thinner than anyone had thought. Part 8. The Willow and the Secret. We spoke of aspirin. But let's go back further, to the willow. For millennia, people knew willow bark helps with pain and fever. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, who lived in the 5th century BC, recommended chewing willow bark for women in labor to ease their pain. Egyptians, Aztecs, Chinese, practically every ancient civilization that lived near willows knew about this. But why? The answer only came in the 19th century, when science learned to isolate active substances from plants. Willow bark turned out to contain salicylic acid, the very same substance from which aspirin was later made. But willow bark is only one example. Folk medicine across the world had pain-relieving remedies long before chemistry learned to explain how they worked. Turmeric contains curcumin, an anti-inflammatory compound. Ginger has a similar effect. Capsaicin from chili peppers relieves surface pain by depleting the neurotransmitter that transmits pain signals. These plants are not just folk medicine. They are a library assembled over millions of years of evolution. Plants developed these compounds to defend themselves against insects and disease. And we learned to use those compounds. Modern pharmacology studies traditional medicine more and more carefully. Roughly half of all medicines trace their roots to natural compounds or their derivatives. Part 9. The opioid crisis. But before we finish, we must speak of the shadow. In the 1990s, American pharmaceutical companies began aggressively promoting a new generation of opioid painkillers: OxyContin, Vicodin, Percocet. They said these drugs were safe, that addiction was rare, that chronic pain had to be treated aggressively. Doctors believed them, prescribed them, millions of prescriptions a year. What happened next, Americans call the opioid crisis. Millions of people became addicted. Hundreds of thousands died from overdoses. Entire towns, especially in the industrial regions where people had lost their jobs and their hope, were quite literally destroyed. This is one of the greatest pharmaceutical catastrophes in history. The company Purdue Pharma, which made OxyContin, knew about the risks. Documents that emerged during legal proceedings showed they had hidden data, bribed doctors, deliberately minimized information about addiction. The Sackler family, who owned the company, paid billions in fines. But the people who died did not come back. This story reminds us of something important. Painkillers are not merely medicine, they are power. And power can always be misused. Part 10. The future of pain. What comes next? Today, scientists are searching for painkillers that don't cause addiction. They study ion channels, tiny gates in neurons through which pain signals pass. Block the right channel, and there is no pain, without euphoria, without addiction. There are people born without the ability to feel pain. It is a rare genetic mutation. You might think this sounds like a gift. In reality, it is a curse. Such people don't know when they are injured. They break bones and keep walking. They don't feel fire burning their skin. They often die young from damage they never noticed. Scientists study their genes, and this provides clues about how certain types of pain could be selectively blocked while preserving pain's protective function. There is another direction, the psychology of pain. We know that pain is not simply a signal from tissue, it is an interpretation. The brain decides how much something hurts based on context, expectations, emotions. Soldiers on the battlefield sometimes feel no pain from bullet wounds until they reach safety. Placebos, sugar tablets, eliminate up to 30% of pain in some patients in clinical trials. Hypnosis, meditation, cognitive behavioral therapy. This is not merely psychology, it is literally changing how the brain processes pain signals. The future of pain relief will probably be combined. Molecules that block specific channels. Psychological techniques that alter perception. Perhaps neural interfaces that allow direct regulation of pain signals. The end. 6,000 years. From the Sumerian joy plant to modern anesthetics that allow surgeons to operate on the heart for hours while the patient sleeps and feels nothing. From screaming on an operating table to a quiet operating room where the only sounds are the soft beeping of monitors and the calm voices of doctors. From opium hand-prepared in Egyptian apothecaries to molecules designed on computers and tested on millions of patients. This is not just a medical history, it is a human one. because everything we see in it is one person's desire to relieve another person's suffering. A father who wants his son to stop hurting. A doctor who cannot bear to watch another's pain. A chemist who sleeps in a laboratory for the sake of a molecule that might change something. Every tablet you take for a headache is 6,000 years of human care, packed into a few milligrams. Not bad for a joy plant. Sleep well,